So now that we have some lights in our scene, let's add some physics to it. So everything in Unity, whenever we create a primitive object like a 3D cube, for example, comes with what's called a collider. And we can see that in the inspector over here, right? Just like how we have all these other properties like the transform property, the mesh renderer, we also have a collider property. And each of these have a different type of collider. So this one's a box collider. Your character actually has a capsule collider on it. Um, so the box collider is what keeps us from just simply running through something. So for example, if I make this a little bit taller, whenever I bump into this, or whenever other physics objects bump into something, we stop and can't move through it, right? I can't simply walk through it. Yet that model that I imported, I can walk right through. So I'm going to talk to you about how to add colliders to things, and then also how to turn on physics. So how to make this something that we could push and knock over. So first, colliders exist as a component. We haven't really talked about components explicitly yet. This will be the first time, but components are all of these things that you see on the right-hand side under each object. So whenever I select a cube, I have all these components. Whenever I select my FPS controller, I have all these components. And components can be added and removed. So for instance, I could right-click remove a component, or I could click add component and type in a name and find a component to add. So this cube, for example, has a box collider. If I right-click and remove that box collider and then hit play, I should be able to simply walk right through this box. And there you go. So it no longer has the collision that it had before that was preventing me from moving through it. If I add a box collider again, so I hit add component and type in box collider, and I find the box collider component, I can add that back in, and by default, it'll just stop me from walking through it. Now, colliders can be edited directly, so I can click this Edit Collider, and it's a little hard to see, but basically it's added these green points that I can click and drag out in this box shape, and I can create my own dynamically sized collider. So for instance, I could actually make a collider an invisible wall, for example, that prevents me from walking forward here just simply by adding a box collider and then dragging out its bounds by clicking this Edit Collider button. So let's hit play and see what happens here. So now I have an invisible wall that I just can't move through. If I hit Edit Collider, I can go back in and grab those different points again. I know they are a little difficult to see, and I can resize it and try and fit it back to my model's size. So I'm going to leave this collider how it is for now. I have an object that doesn't have a collider because it's a mesh that I've brought in from another piece of software, and this mesh could be any sort of dimension, and adding a collider to it may not necessarily match its dimensions. So if I add a component, I add a box collider, that box collider luckily works because this is already a cube shape, so it just sort of matches that shape. But let's say, for example, we had a more organic or more unique shape, and we wanted to add a capsule collider. A capsule collider is what's on our character controller, and it is the shape of a capsule. It's basically a sphere. So if we were making a ball or a pill or something like that, we would use a capsule collider. We can add multiple colliders to an object. So for example, I can add a box collider, edit it by moving it around, and then I could add another box collider. And I can edit that one as well. So you can start to create some complex collision shapes. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove these colliders, getting back to my default, and I'm just going to add a simple box collider. There's other colliders. There's like a mesh collider. If you just type in the word collider, you're going to find a ton of different ones. Play around with those and see what they all do. For now, I have this box collider on this object, and if I hit play, I can't move through that object. It'll prevent me from moving through it. Now, a collider interacts with other collidable objects in a scene, so if you had, for instance, other characters or things like that, you could have them running into this object. But also, most importantly, we can now interact with an object on a physics level. I'm going to add what's called a rigid body. So I'm going to type in the word rigid, and then rigid body shows up. It's this second entry right here. And whenever I click it, it adds a rigid body component to my model. I'm going to hit play, and what's going to happen is rigid body basically says, enable some physics on this. Create a physics body for this. So whenever I hit play, my box is actually going to fall to the ground, as you just saw there. And I should be able to, if it's not too large, push this box around. So I can knock it off the edge here, and just kind of jump on top of it. I could push it over into this corner. So we can start to create more complex games by adding these rigid bodies. I'm going to remove this box collider and add a new box collider just to kind of reset it. Now I'm going to add a rigid body, and I'll hit play. So these rigid bodies add a lot of dynamic aspects to your game, right? You can very easily create a little physics-based, puzzler or physics-based platforming game really, really easily. In the rigid body component, we have tons of options like mass. If I turn that down, it's going to treat this like a smaller object. So it's much, much, much lighter. I can change the drag, if it has gravity or not. So if I turn off gravity and I hit this object, it's just going to float away endlessly. I think that's a good place to end this video. So play around with the rigid body component and the box collider and other collider components just to get a feel for how they work.